Well, welcome everyone. It's great to be here again. Always a pleasure to be back on From the Woods today. Today I'm going to be talking to you about degraded woodlands. This is something that is, as Billy mentioned, unfortunately, a common occurrence across Kentucky and really across the region, across Central Appalachia, and most of the hardwood regions, right? So when we talk about degraded woodlands, we mean something specific, and we'll get into talking about what that is, what causes degraded woodlands, and a little bit about kind of what we can do, right? And it's tricky because it is a complex problem that has a lot of unique characteristics depending on what has caused that degradation, in order to manage, to rehabilitate, and to restore that function and merchantability in the woodland. So quick, just a really brief definition, and this is truly a simplified definition of what we're talking about, but I think it kind of encompasses the problem, right? And that's a lack of function in the forest or woodland, a lack of merchantability, and overall health, right? An unhealthy forest that lacks these characteristics. So a degraded woodland, right? When we talk about merchantability, we often use this term to describe the trees, right? Acceptable growing stock, or you'll see this abbreviation AGS, right? That's what foresters use to describe the amount of merchantable trees or desirable trees in the forest versus unacceptable growing stock, or you might see that as UGS abbreviated if you're looking at any forestry documents or any publications that reference the merchantability of the forest. Right. And when we have that lack of merchantability or that lack of acceptable growing stock in the forest, that might preclude our ability to harvest, right? To go in and have any merchantable entries into the forest that might align with our management goals for that forest, right? And it can produce both short and long-term problems for the sustainability of that woodland. Right. Sustainability can mean a number of things, but if we bring it back to that definition of what degraded forests are degrading, right? That function of the forest, the sustainability of the function, sustainability of the profitability of the forest, and really the health of the forest, right? That it can perpetuate into the forest or into the future, maintaining those characteristics. And unfortunately, it can render some of our commonly used silvicultural methods ineffective, right? Or at least it might take a lot more effort to rehabilitate that forest, depending on how degraded that forest is, right? But I mentioned silvicultural practices, right? And I thought I would quickly reintroduce the definition of silviculture. And I've talked about it before on this program, but just to refresh you, right? So silviculture, and that's what I study, and that's what a big part of my job is in silviculture, right? And that's the practice of controlling the establishment, so the regeneration of the forest, the composition, which is the diverse suite of species that call that forest home. The character and growth of the forest. So the vertical and the horizontal characteristics of that forest or woodland that satisfy specific objectives, right? To meet the landowner's management objective, or society in the case of our national forests or state forests. But that silviculture is broadly applied to control these elements, or to help control these elements through action in the forest, right? So what causes the degradation and some of the effects to the forest, right? A number of things can impact the forest But these are the common things that we see, particularly here in this region. So past land uses is a big factor, right? And that can include a number of things, right? A couple of them that I'll talk about today, one of those being poor logging techniques, right? Or multiple logging entries without giving a lot of consideration for the residual trees. So residual being the trees that are left behind, as opposed to the trees that are being removed through the logging. High grading, and we'll talk about this one in detail as well. The repeated entries that can have impacts such as compacting soils and again damage to those residual trees, insects and diseases directly affecting the health of the forest. Grazing, particularly by cattle, can have impacts, as well as wildfire and a number of other things. But these are kind of the key things that we see that cause degraded woodlands from past land use and mismanagement of those. So we'll talk about mainly just today these first two, but these other components are important. But we just don't have time to cover all of the things that degrade a forest, right? So poor logging, and this isn't to throw shade at the logging community, and that's in fact why we have a program right here in the department with partnership with KDF, the Master Logger Program. That really goes to helping prevent a lot of these things which cause degraded forest. But nevertheless, poor logging can have impacts on the forest, right? And some of the things that it can create are heart rot, right? So rotting in the heartwood of the tree, so kind of from the inside out, which has a number of problems when we're talking about the merchantability, the structure of the forest and its sustainability into the future. Causes form problems, right? And so this is also related to the merchantability of the tree. Whether poor logging causes impacts to those residual trees that might knock them kind of off kilter or create openings or damage that introduces bacteria and thus creating heart rot in the forest, and it can alter the regeneration. And we'll talk a little bit about that as well, or at least I'll show kind of a study looking at what poor logging, and not even really poor logging, but poor timing of logging can do or impact regeneration. Right? But as I mentioned, heart rot. Right, and this can happen. You see it in this little picture here, resulting from skidding, which is pulling the logs out using a tractor or a skidder out of the woodlands, causing damage to those trees that remain, introducing that bacteria and rot, removing bark and major damage or branch damage that can also introduce bacteria into the tree and thus degrade the quality of that tree. And if that happens across woodland or out throughout a logging project, ultimately having an impact on that entire woodland or that tract. Right. Going back to that regeneration question, I pulled this study that was done here in the region, and this is just kind of a quick snapshot of that, but it shows some of our main species here, right? And those are the abbreviations: that WHO white oak, the SC scarlet oak, NRO northern red oak, black oak being there, right? And this has to do with the timing of the logging and the success of those seedlings. So the success being those seedlings that were there prior to the logging and those that were there following the logging, right? And when those seedlings were over 3 feet in height, those advanced region, right? Those are those region that are there present in the understory. And then when we remove canopy trees, those then recruit into the canopy, those trees have a much higher success rate than smaller, right? It might be kind of intuitive, but it's important, right? And so this goes to the timing of entry into the forest, where we have considerably higher success rate or survival rate of seedlings if we let them mature or do certain activities, right? And we've talked about certain silvicultural prescriptions like mid-story removal to help those advanced region get a little bit bigger and more competitive, so that when we go in, right? And if we fail to do that, we can have a regeneration failure, which can perpetuate the degradation of the forest. Right? High grading, right? This is a term that I'm quite certain every forest owner has heard and is familiar with, right? And this has to do with the type of tree removal, right? The logging practice, or even described as a silvicultural practice, being a diameter limit cut, where we go in and remove the best, most merchantable, desirable species and just kind of leave everything else, right? And that's a common because it's really cost effective in the short term, right? You identify the trees that you can make a profit from and go in and just pull those out, not worrying about the other trees, and then just kind of letting the stand begin to regenerate itself, right? And there's a number of problems that can happen or do happen when we do this practice, right? Number one, it immediately reduces the emerchantability of the acceptable growing stock, right? The AGS reduces that volume and it perpetuates that, right? When we remove those desirable species, who do you, or which species are going to be there to regenerate and propagate their seeds to the next subsequent regeneration, or the regenerating class or that cohort into the future, right? And so you remove those trees and you're creating a lot of these feedbacks, or these negative feedbacks, where these less desirable species are the ones that are regenerating, right? So it reduces that over time, right? And we can lose vigor of the stand. And there's another component here where we're removing the best genetics oftentimes, right? And so there's a genetic component of forest, right? Every tree has its own hereditary characteristics, right? And those genes are passed down from tree to tree. And good trees lay or drop good seed that develop into good trees, right? And that good could be subjective, but right, desirable growth characteristics, being straight, having growth or adequate growth over time. But when we remove those genetics from the forest and we leave those poor genetics, that's what's going to remain. And over time, that directly impacts the forest and degrades the forest stand or cohort by cohort over time, right? Alters species composition, and this one is kind of intuitive to what I was just talking about. And it creates a lot of variability in the stand, right? The stocking, the density, the canopy, right? Because you're just going in and selecting the best trees without much consideration for any of that spatial, those spatial characteristics that might help a future stand. You're not concerned about that. So it seems quite obvious why this could be or is a problematic practice that directly impacts the forest and leads to those degraded forests. When we look across the landscape here in Kentucky and the region, unfortunately, there's a large history or a long history of high grading in the area, where a majority of the logging practices or silvicultural treatments are those that go in and remove those best trees, right? For short-term gain. And I understand that as a landowner falling on hard times, and you have this resource and it's easy to tap into. But when we high grade, we're kind of only allowing ourselves to tap into it that one time. We're not investing in that forest in the future to perpetuate returns, kind of thinking about that as a investment in your land, as your portfolio, thinking about how to invest with that. Similarly, looking at the species composition of these different treatments, you can see that following those high grading practices, we're left with a lot more maple in the landscape than was there before, right? Or these other species, oftentimes they're more shade tolerant species that can grow, or these music species that kind of hang around and outcompete those important species, right? And I'm not just talking about economically important, but ecologically important, right? Oak species are really important to our forests here in Kentucky, right? Important for wildlife, for the function of the forest and the health of the forest. When we go in and cut out all of that, right, we high grade out because white oak, even in red oak, a lot of these are more merchantable species. When we cut those out, this is what's left, right? A lot of maple, right, that's been either hanging out in as those advanced regen or those seedlings, right? And that's what develops up. And if you allow that to happen, to that maple stand to mature, right, it's going to be more and more difficult to rehabilitate that stand into one that is perhaps more historical, right? So high grading has a lot of impacts to the forest. Spatially, it increases the amount of light, which can have impacts, and that's not always a bad thing, right? As a silviculturist, we're continually controlling the light regime, right? We're kind of playing around with the canopy trees, cutting those, then the light that's penetrating through into the forest. And that's an important function of these hardwood forests, is the light manipulation, right? But when we high grade and introduce that light, that can perpetuate those less desirable characteristics and species, and it oftentimes does increase undesirable mid-story trees, right? And creating that heterogeneity, which again might not be a bad thing, depending, but it all comes down to the health, so the genetics that's left, or the genotypes that's left in the forest, the species composition, and a lot of those things determines kind of the growth characteristics and the function of that forest. So our goal, right, as a forester, as a landowner, is to build that function, merchantability, and health back into our forest, right? To reverse the degraded forest, to regrade, right? If that makes sense. But to me, there's three areas that are important to focus on as landowners, as foresters, in order to rehabilitate and regenerate our forest, right? And so we need to think about what's there, right? This is following a high grading or some degraded, or just a degraded forest in general. But those residual trees that are there, right? Can they be rehabilitated? Right? Is there some functional value retaining them, or is there going to be investment to go in and kind of do a restoration type treatment or a forest stand improvement to go in and help kind of redirect that stand into one that's healthier and more merchantable? Focusing on the regenerating class, right? So regenerating species. Right. We don't often need to plant trees here in this region because trees grow, they want to grow. That's not a problem regenerating trees, but regenerating the right species can be a challenge. So planting species or seedlings could be an option if your forest has moved away from those desirable species, and needing to promote or redirect that back to one that is healthier and functioning as it has historically, right? And then thinking about the future. right? Maintaining and building that regenerative capacity, right? So that means that ability of the forest to continually regenerate and maintain those positive, sustainable characteristics and qualities of the forest, so that the acceptable growing stock is perpetuated into the future and regenerated, right? And these are not necessarily the easiest things to manage all at the same time. They can be quite complex, right? And as a landowner without a forestry degree or training, it's complex, and it can be even complex for those in the field, right? So to just quickly kind of summarize, and I know this was a really brief kind of introduction of the topic, a topic that is a large, complex topic, but just to summarize this introduction to the concept, a variety of practices and events can lead to these specific and cumulative impacts that degrade the forest. Right? And there's a number of events that can happen. I described two of those: high grading, poor logging, but a number of things can have impacts that degrade the quality of the forest, right? That have impacts on the form, the amount, so the volume, the merchantable volume of the forest, and its ability to kind of regenerate and maintain those qualities and characteristics, right? Each impact has different timelines and requirements to rehabilitate. Right? If there's a loss of species, that could be one of the most difficult tasks to I don't want to say reintroduce, but to get that species back into the forest where it is growing up healthy and regenerating. Okay. And it's also important to think about the future. Right? As a landowner, I always encourage landowners to think about what they want their forest to look like in the future, right? And your goals and objectives for that forest, and then work with a forester to help get you there, right? So the forest management plan or stewardship plan, along with silvicultural prescription, is really a roadmap to get you from, if your forest is currently in a degraded state, to one that is healthy and functioning, right? And so thinking about the desired future conditions of the stand and the components of the stand that we can manage and correct over time, right? So the current stand condition, the regenerative capacity of the forest, and future subsequent regenerating cohorts, right? Classes of the forest. And silvicultural prescriptions, I firmly believe should be developed with the help of a forester. There's a number of KDF foresters that have training on degraded forests and forest management that can help you rehabilitate or regenerate your forest, and others, consulting foresters that have that ability across the state. And so if you're a landowner in this situation, which isn't uncommon, there is help and expertise to help you succeed, right? And the success of those prescriptions, we can gauge that based on obtaining those desired future conditions. So are we meeting our goals, right? And we have to have that roadmap and that on a piece of paper for us to know whether we're successful, right? And so it's important to know what we currently have and what our goals are for the future, right? And so forest inventory and assessment is an important first step, and then developing that management plan with a forester. There are a number of guidelines that can be helpful for landowners as well as forest managers to kind of help set those standards. And if you do have any questions, feel free to shoot me an email, and I'd be happy to provide any more resources.